I learned to sew from my mother at a young age. Back then, sewing was an important part of domestic skills, creating clothing for the family, household textiles, drapes, and upholstery. Though a child of the 60s and not interested in perfecting my domestic skills, I loved the sewing machine and the magic it held. A flat piece of cloth, any cloth, could become something creative, inspired, personal, and I could wear it. I sewed my own clothes and started a small dressmaking and alterations business when I was 15. My love of fiber and textiles only grew when I went to art school and discovered a fully equipped textile studio at Montclair State. I learned to spin wool, dye with natural dyes, print on cloth, and most importantly, I learned to weave. Or rather, I was introduced to the loom. I say that because hand weaving represents a set of skills that can take a lifetime to learn and yet still feel like they only scratch the surface of possibilities. The ability to create cloth to sew garments was obvious to me from the beginning. Though my art degree focused on conceptual ideas, communication of thoughts, and social commentary, function played an important role in the direction I took with my work once I left college. I started my career working for a hand-weaving designer, creating mohair yardage for them, and even a few garments. Eventually, I began to create my own line of hand-woven textiles and exhibited that line in craft fairs all over the Northeast. There is no greater teacher of efficiency than production, and no greater teacher of the human body than creating custom clothing for clients. Eventually, I backed away from the intense world of craft fairs and started to teach. There, I found my true calling, empowering others to make clothing for themselves from their own hands. That left me to explore, experiment, and play with works that didn't have to be reproduced for sale, and that I could pour my love of textiles into without worrying about price point. I could hand paint warps, I could dye my own yarns, I could weave complex structures, and I could create my own patterns or use a commercial one. I continued to weave, to play, to experiment, and to enjoy my passion, one I've held for more than 60 years. The COVID years, which stopped all of my travel for teaching, left me time to develop a digital legacy, one where I could continue to empower students to make their own garments, potentially from their own cloth. My daughter helped with the technical end of filming, editing, and developing more than 80 videos for a YouTube channel, The Weaver Sews. I began writing articles for various textile publications back in 2000 and have written more than 100 articles and digital content. That legacy will outlive me and allows me to keep playing with whatever fiber or technique crosses my path. Sustainability has always been important to me, though it was more of a necessity in the early 1990s than an environmental cause. After a decade of production work, weaving 30 to 60 yards of hand-woven fabric per week and cutting it into garments to be sold at craft fairs, I amassed a very large collection of scrap leftover hand-woven fabric, all carefully stored in my attic. With the birth of 2 children in my 30s, traveling to sell my work became prohibitive, and weaving new yardage and creating new production work seemed pointless and expensive. I am, above all, a creative person, and not having the income for raw materials or outlets for my hand-woven garments. Selling on the internet was not a thing in the early 1990s. I began to explore ways to use the massive collection of leftover scraps stored in the attic. I could, in fact, create new cloth from the old leftovers and create innovative and fun garments without threading a loom. I developed a technique for piecing garments together using a fusible backing and bias tubes stitched over the joins. While attending a conference in Ohio in 2000, my first time away from my children for any length of time, I met the editor of HANDWOVEN magazine, who was impressed with my work and the lectures I gave. I was invited to submit an article for the next publication, and I built the Slice and Dice vest, featured here, documenting the steps. That article changed the trajectory of my career. I went on to become the contributing features editor for HANDWOVEN magazine and wrote articles, columns, and essays for the next 35 issues. In 2005, I was asked as the judge for the fashion show at a weaving conference in Wisconsin to provide a couple of works for the fashion show finale. With little time to prepare, weaving new cloth wasn't realistic, but piecing together old scraps allowed me to make two graphic and substantial garments, Cocoon and Peacock Fantasy, that were worthy of a fashion show finale. My son attended County College of Morris as a theater major in 2009 and was featured in a production of Once on This Island. I was asked to help costume the show, and the God of Water wore Peacock Fantasy on stage. For me, cloth is cloth, whether it exists in a finished form, as in a garment, or as a scrap from another project. When a garment or other form of textile, like a blanket or throw, is no longer useful to me because it no longer fits, it no longer matches my sofa, the dog ate one corner of the throw, or its exhibition life is past due, it is still a valuable piece of cloth which can be repurposed into something else. Garments that were designed for the runway or exhibitions are usually ones I don't have the opportunity to wear on a regular basis. And in the exhibition world, typically juries want work that's been completed in the last 2 years. That makes a closet full of exhibition work that has no purpose other than archival. And there are pieces that just aren't that wonderful. And that's okay in the creative world. And experimentation is an important part of my creative practice. But the cloth is still valuable. And it isn't unusual for me to look at older work and decide to repurpose the cloth into something I can use. The frosted florals hand-painted gown was languishing in my closet. It had been featured in various publications, exhibitions, and fashion shows. I loved the piece, but it no longer fit me and served no purpose. I broke it into two very usable tops, featured here, that I have worn many times since. Leftover scraps from repurposing were then made into tote bags and sold in fundraisers. Spirit Mist was made from a mohair wrap coat I had made and gifted to my late mother-in-law. She wore it proudly for a number of years, and after her passing, I restyled it into a jacket I've worn proudly for years. That same mother-in-law was also a weaver, and in her stash was a lovely long wool skirt she had woven from her hand-spun yarn. It sat in my closet for years until I decided to make something from it I would wear on a regular basis. I've repurposed old, unsold production pieces that had been tucked away in the attic after I quit showing my work in craft fairs. The color-blocked dress was remade from a tea dress found in the attic, along with a pair of wool crepe pants. I am not above taking a garment from my wardrobe, even of commercial fabric, and repurposing it into something fresh. Cloth is cloth. Jacket with felted collar was created from a dress woven as part of an ensemble from a collaboration with another textile artist for a challenge for Convergence Tampa 2008. Convergence was sponsored by the Handweavers Guild of America. The dress paired with a more substantial coat, seen in a photograph elsewhere in the exhibition. The collaborating artists kept the coat, and I kept the dress, which didn't fit me, and I really didn't have any use for. It had already toured with an exhibition for over 2 years. I loved the jacket it became, and taking something apart, seam by seam, is metaphoric in itself. Cloth is cloth. In the late 1990s, I found myself at a crossroads. I had young school-aged children at home and not many outlets commercially for my creativity. For the first time in my career, I found that I had things to say and no tangible vehicle in which to say them. The technology to allow printing on cloth was very new at the time. T-shirt transfers were becoming mainstream, and eventually the direct printing on cloth became viable for a home studio practice. There was an immediacy to printing images on cloth, and I began to experiment with how to make use of that technology and incorporate it into a wearable garment, which was a vehicle I understood. There is something metaphoric about a garment. The public face on the outside is what the world sees, but there's a private side, the lining, that only the wearer knows is there. The first experiment, Past Lives, showed me I could print images from a beloved trip to England 10 years before and print them on silver lame. I had rescued a few fur coats, some with disintegrating skins, but some areas still usable, and I created this vest from leftover scraps from one of my production fabrics, lined with a rescued fur coat. I immediately moved into a similar piece, Wild Things, also using fur, with images I had taken of my 2 rambunctious dogs who always seemed like they were fighting, but for dogs, this was glorious roughhousing, not unlike my 2 children. The jangling of their collars with tags as they played and roughhoused together made me wonder if I could simulate that sound with jingle shells picked up on the beach and strung together. In Memoriam was an important piece for me. I had friends who were turning 40 and were disgusted with the way their bodies were aging, and I couldn't help but be saddened by the way our society discards women who are no longer young, thin, and beautiful. I appropriated a Vargas girl from a Playboy magazine spread and worked out how to create a life-size version with a lot of help from Photoshop, which I was learning how to use, and a small inkjet printer. Again, I used scraps from my production years, and the fur was cut from the car seat covers from my retired beloved car. I used whatever was at hand. The inside, the private part of the garment, was filled with images of friends and important people who impacted my life, including my kindergarten photo, as my own daughter was graduating from kindergarten that same year. How would body image play out in her life? As one of my closest friends' marriage dissolved, it was painful watching 2 people who once loved one another become bitter enemies. The Victim is about men and women, all of us who have allowed ourselves to become victims of others, victims of ourselves and our own toxic behaviors, victims of society and a culture that defines who we should be and does not accept who we are. The final piece in this grouping was created after the passing of my father. Helping my mother go through his belongings, looking through boxes of slides and images he took from my childhood, I was struck by how my years growing up defined who I am today, and how these beautiful memories were all recorded, but not one of them showed my father because he was the one recording those images. They are all purposefully included on the inside lining only, their influence, private, embedded files. When the garment is worn, it is just a beautiful mohair cloud in white. No one knows the background or the story behind each one of us unless they look inside. I call this grouping of work visual narratives. There is something very metaphorical about taking an image, cutting it apart, and reweaving it back together. It is healing as each row is reconnected to the last one. There have been so many events in my life that I needed my creativity to voice that which I couldn't say. A breast cancer diagnosis at age 46 was not something I ever anticipated, and having young children, and I had hoped a long creative life ahead of me, I was brought up short by the diagnosis itself and all that scary scientific stuff that went along with it. Body destruction, chemotherapy and all its side effects, and an uncertain future created turmoil in my daily life and creative practice. When my beloved mother-in-law died at age 99, the loss of her seemed monumental. She was a weaver and a spinner and a master bobbin lace maker, and we had such a connection through fiber that decades later, her voice is still clear in my head. I was beside her when she died, and I drew a quick sketch of her and the grace she showed, even in death, on a hospital napkin, which I carried with me for months until I thought to preserve it digitally. In watching death come, it was the perfect image to print on silk, cut apart, and carefully weave her life and her constant presence back together row by row. Margaret, a diptych, showed her at 20 and her at 90. The eyes and the playful expression unchanged for over 7 decades. In August of 2001, my husband and I decided to spend the week in New York City with the children, seeing all of the things tourists see that locals take for granted. One of the highlights of the trip was traveling to the top of the World Trade Center, and I captured the playful innocence of 2 children on top of the world. Little did anyone know that in 2 short weeks, the towers would no longer exist, and my children's innocent childhood would come to an end, as the United States embarked on endless conflicts in the Middle East. Secrets is a detail of a larger piece, which was sold many years ago, that showed the innocence of 2 sisters, my younger sister and I, as we looked at a book and communicated in a way only sisters can. No Fear was woven from a photo printed on cotton from our first Christmas card showing our new son surrounded by the tribe of animals who we also thought of as our children. These are the moments we hold on to, and recreating them row by row etched them into the memories that define us. Still life is just a fun piece. Though challenging technically with only a small desk printer, it is woven from a digital print on cotton from a small color aid study made in a color studies class in college in the 1970s. Drawing on motifs and images from my youth bridges the years between then and now and helps define who I was and who I became. The Spouse, one of my personal post series, was woven from an image also created in a photography class in college. I still had the negative and have used it repeatedly in my work over the last 20 years. When I created Evolution, I was in a very dark place in my life. I was undergoing treatment for breast cancer and found life genuinely challenging. I sat in my studio and I just looked at the stash I had accumulated over the years and wondered if I would be able to use any of it. That created a sudden determination to create something, anything, from what was in front of me, whether it was successful or not. It was important to keep my hands moving. I had woven the 8-shaft shadow weave fabric, which was sitting on the shelf, and the lining just about jumped off my shelf, a length of polyester cloth I had silk screened in a surface design class in college. I wove bands on an inkle loom for the trim out of the leftover yarns from the shadow weave fabric. This garment led to what is still, more than 2 decades later, one of my most popular articles from the years I was features editor of Handwoven magazine, Designing from the Stash. Accumulating a stash is a grand adventure, and one that visual artists, especially fiber artists, find important to their creativity. But using that stash for design inspiration is equally important. I always try to use what I have at hand, replacing stash when it is appropriate. Over the 10 years I sold my handwoven garments in craft fairs throughout the Northeast, I developed a collection of silhouettes, variations on a theme, that allowed a client to customize their garment. Jackets became vests, and then jackets became coats, collars optional, etc. When I began to teach garment construction to handweavers sometime in the late 1990s, I used those patterns I had developed into a group that I could use for teaching purposes. One of the more popular silhouettes I designed was a simple walking vest with armhole bands instead of sleeves. When COVID shut down my ability to travel to teach, and all bookings were canceled for the foreseeable future, I employed my daughter, who is much more skilled technologically than I am, had her learn how to use Adobe Illustrator, and scan and digitize all the patterns I used for my classes in all the sizes. We spent many months proofing the patterns and creating substantial directions. I used the COVID downtime to create a legacy of information so students could obtain the information without relying on me. It became apparent pretty quickly that there needed to be video support. Once again, I had my daughter learn Adobe Premiere and figure out how to create YouTube content. The result was 80 videos on my channel, The Weaver Sews, and each of the 12 garment patterns I sell has an accompanying multiple-page book of directions with links to the videos where video support is provided. I was one of the lucky ones that was able to use the COVID years to my advantage and digitize everything I could about my business and my skill set. The 600 walking vest is still one of my favorite silhouettes, and I use it often, sometimes combining the pattern with elements from other patterns in my collection. All 3 of the garments in this grouping are variations on the 600 walking vest. All 12 of my patterns can be purchased and downloaded from my eShop. arts, no matter what level of experience, it is important to take workshops, seminars, and master classes to continue learning new techniques, find inspiration, and sometimes just to study another's teaching style. There are many craft schools throughout the country, conferences in every field, and local organizations like weaving guilds to help create these opportunities to try new skills and expand creativity. Though I have taught at all of them, I can and should also participate as a student. Over the years, I've taken many classes with other teachers, especially in weaving. There is a lifetime of concepts, skills, and techniques to learn, and even though I have spent a lifetime teaching and developing a large body of work, I still often feel as though I have just scratched the surface. Each of us finds that niche that allows us to bloom, to thrive, and to nurture that passion. Mine was handwoven clothing. But there is always something to learn from another instructor. This group of work represents the results of some of the workshops I've taken over the years. Studying a rug weaving technique called krokbragd with Tom Knisley left me with a gorgeous sampler, too small for a rug, but too bulky for something wearable. I created this tote bag, which has become my favorite travel bag. The summer top was a workshop with Rosalie Nielsen in huck lace and block design. I wove the fabric intended for dish towels, of which I have too many, and so I carefully planned from the samples I had this lacy cotton summer top in pastel colors. I studied bubble cloth with Karen Dondy and wove a narrow length of cloth from merino and tencel. When aggressively washed, the merino shrunk and the tencel did not, creating a differential shrinkage and hence bubbles. I had a couple of yards of this narrow cloth and decided it would make excellent trim on a vest with wool melton I had in my stash. The crimp cloth vest is from a class with Diane Totten in a workshop of the same name. By using a synthetic weft thread and weaving a heavy contrasting sewing thread across in a specific pattern, once the cloth came off the loom, the contrasting sewing thread was pulled tight across the cloth, gathering or crimping the cloth very tight. The resulting bundle was steamed, and the synthetic weft held the memory of that position permanently, creating a crimped cloth once the pull threads were removed. It was a painstaking process, but fun to explore, and I created this lovely vest which molds to the body. The turned tackete vest was woven in a workshop with Catherine Weber, who creates hand-painted warps and teaches how to integrate them using structure to generate gorgeous block designs. Once the cloth was woven, I created this zippered vest trimmed with linen using one of the patterns from my pattern collection. The double weave jacket was an extreme labor of love. I took a class with Jennifer Moore, who is known for her use of double weave. In double weave, 2 or more layers are woven simultaneously, and depending on the block structure, the layers can change places throughout the cloth. That means each face of the cloth, the front side and the reverse side, look completely different. Once the class was over, I still had probably 3 yards of warp left on the loom to weave off. Unfortunately, I fell and seriously broke my left shoulder in 2 places, taking me out of commission for over a year. That didn't stop me from figuring out how to keep going, creating, and weaving off the rest of the warp. With only one functioning arm, I managed to weave about 6 inches a day and felt like I had conquered the world. I struggled with a way to show off both sides of the cloth at the same time, Because garments are my first choice of how to best use a hand-woven fabric, I came upon the idea that I could surround each double woven sample with windows, creating a completely reversible jacket. Each face completely different in appearance. Each of the windows is carefully hand-stitched in a reverse applique technique. I sat for hours on the sofa, again with only one really usable arm, but could prop the work on pillows and keep stitching. It has always been important to me to find a way to keep working, stay creative, and keep learning and trying new things. Even when injury, illness, family trauma, and loss of equipment happen, and they will, no one can take away my ability to think and create. Silk City Fibers, formerly of Paterson, New Jersey, now a division of Lion Brand Yarns, developed from a mill and distributor to a luxury fiber supplier of weaving yarns. Their beginnings paralleled my own career, and I used their yarns almost exclusively in my production years. Over the years, I acted as a consultant for them in technical aspects, as a local hand weaver, and in the early days as a color consultant. In 2020, with the world shutting down from the COVID pandemic, every industry struggled to find a way to stay open, to stay relevant, and to stay alive. The head of the Silk City Fibers division approached me with some of their new yarn lines and asked if I could test them out, see what kind of fabric I could produce from them, and possibly design something that used these yarns. I was happy for any creative challenge that came my way, paid or not, during the long shutdown. It was great fun for me to take a very small grouping of specific yarns and turn them into something wonderful. Those are the kinds of challenges I like best. I created 4 fabrics for Silk City Fibers, and I was able to keep the garments I made from them. I just provided PDF project sheets, which they distributed to clients and customers for free. The PDF project sheets are available as free downloads from my eShop. Antique jewels, confetti, shadow tapestry, and summer rain. Links will be in the show notes below. In 2000, I gave a lecture at Convergence, an international fiber conference sponsored by the Handweavers Guild of America in Cincinnati, Ohio. The editor of Handwoven magazine was impressed by my talk and approached me to consider writing an article for them. Within a year of my first published article, I was asked to become the contributing features editor of that magazine. My career as an author exploded. Writing for assignments in school was never my creative outlet, but apparently I knew how to write. And the editor liked my style of writing, and I actually had something to say. By this point, I had been creating hand-woven clothing for nearly 20 years, and definitely had something to say. And I enjoyed researching topics I didn't have a background in. Made much easier since I had collected a vast textile library. Knowledge is power. And though no one can know everything, anyone can learn where to find the information. In the textile world, there are many journals, books, and periodicals that predate Google or any internet search, and they remain the authorities of good practice and inspiration. And so I've written, some 24 years later, more than 100 articles and digital content for various publications, mostly from US publishers, but I've had work published in Canada and the UK. Each editor brings their own vision and fresh approach. Learning what they need and yet staying true to my voice and vision is something I've improved on over the years. This grouping shows some of the garments that were created for a specific article, but more often than not, the garment became the inspiration for the article. Magazines represented here include Handwoven magazine from Long Thread Media, Shuttle, Spindle, and Die Pot from the Handweavers Guild of America, and Threads magazine, formerly from Taunton Press. When I set up my loom, I typically put on a lengthy warp for yardage. I never have a goal for that yardage, just that I like to weave. And if I'm going to go through the warping process, I might as well have lots to actually weave. In the weaving community, setting up the loom for 5 scarves is about the same effort as setting up the loom for 1 scarf. Weavers always think in multiples. And I don't have a plan. Inspiration comes from many sources, like a bale of blanket selvages from the Pendleton woolen mill I procured while on a tour during a weaving conference in Oregon. I look at raw material or potential raw material and wonder what I can do with it. And then once I weave it, the finished yardage becomes a new raw material that I will eventually turn into something else, usually a garment. Occasionally, I'm given yarn for a challenge, as I was in 2008 for a design challenge collaboration for Convergence Handweavers Conference in Tampa for the Handweavers Guild of America. I love those kinds of challenges. The parameters are really tight, and I have to be very creative within those tight parameters. The metallic top and subsequent vest from leftovers was a commission from many years ago. The client, my mom, gave me a bag of yarn she bought for knitting and decided she would never use it and asked me to weave her something. Many years later, the top came back to me, as all things do, from a parent. Because I never have a plan for what I weave, I use all the yarn I have pulled for that specific yardage, and that often determines how much I weave. Typically, I have lots of yardage left over, which allows me to use the remainder for either another garment or an endless supply of tote bags, zippered bags, and small gift items to sell at my Weaving Guild's annual sale. Cloth is cloth, and using up all of an 8 to 10 yard length of yardage gives me great satisfaction. Writing regularly for Handwoven magazine exposed me to areas of study that I hadn't thought about before. I wrote a fabric color forecast column, publishing 2 groups of palettes per year, spring and fall, and the research into the color forecasting industry and working with yarn vendors and pattern designers gave me tremendous inspiration. In 2005, after a weaving conference in New England, one of the weavers I used to help design garments for the forecast column, Sarah Goodman from Lyme, New Hampshire, invited me to her studio to learn how to dye yarns and paint warps. Her premise was that if I wrote this forecast column, which was not only used by weavers, but also dyers and other surface designers, that I should know something about dyeing. And she was right. So off I went to Sarah's beautiful studio in the mountains, and over a 3-day period I learned how to use synthetic dyes, both acid and fiber reactive, and I learned how to hand paint warps, which was just becoming a thing back in 2005. That 3 days changed the trajectory of my work for the next 20 years. I learned how to control color, to create color, to combine color, and I brought home several hand-dyed warps, presumably for scarves, and hung them in my studio for a few months. I'm not usually a scarf weaver, and it occurred to me that I could put them all together into one warp and create yardage. The result of that is Phoenix Rising, the first yardage I made where I started with white yarn and created the color myself. I immediately followed it with Dragonfly, and the rest is history. I found that I could just dye small 100 to 200 yard skeins of varying fibers and create a wall of options that aren't available commercially. Much of the work I create now started with white yarn. And when I dye yarn or paint warps, I never have a goal in mind. Winter is for creating color, and by spring, I've usually refilled my colorful wall of skeins, and then I can start setting up the loom. Weaving is an interlacement of two elements, vertical and horizontal. A loom is anything that can hold the vertical threads parallel and under tension. Typically, I work on a shaft loom, which allows long lengths of yardage and the ability to create patterns by the interlacement of vertical and horizontal, or warp and weft. No one quite knows the origin of the inkle loom as we know it today, but tightly woven warp face bands have their place in almost every culture with a textile tradition. Even Shakespeare references inkles 3 times in his works. The inkle loom as we know it today is an inexpensive and very portable type of loom that allows easy setup and weaves warp face ribbons or bands. It's the perfect tool for creating edging trims on French cardigan-style jackets made famous by Coco Chanel. The garments here and others in the exhibition have inkle woven trim, made on a loom like the one displayed here, or on one slightly larger, which allows more width and length. In 2014, I was asked to write an article for Threads magazine on how to weave custom trims. 2 of the garments featured here were included in that article, along with the inkle loom included in the exhibition. There are other ways to achieve a fabric besides a horizontal and vertical interlacement of threads, as in weaving. Felting, the process of permanently tangling together wool fibers into a matted surface using heat, water, and agitation, dates back thousands of years. Wool has unique properties that allow the scales to latch onto one another, creating a dense, warm cloth. Because I taught garment making to fiber artists, in addition to hand weavers and quilters, I would also occasionally have felters in my workshops. Felted cloth has unique properties that woven cloth doesn't have, such as finished natural edges and stability on the bias. There are no grain lines in felted cloth. In addition, the scales of the wool fibers can grab onto a gauzy traditional woven fabric, creating a felt laminate. It was important that I learn to felt, making it easier to guide felters in my workshops, learning how to celebrate the uniqueness of the cloth. Felting is a physical craft, hours of rolling and agitation to create a controlled, even cloth. I do prefer to weave. There is something about the loom that will always draw me, but I created a few pieces specifically for workshop purposes that celebrate this unusual cloth in something wearable. Arctic Sky is hand woven, but I've used the laminate technique of felting wool onto silk to create the piping in the princess seams. Winter Landscape uses the natural edge of the felt, since each of the pattern sections were felted individually. Remaining fibers were hand spun into a 2-ply yarn and hand couched over any machine stitching. In Winter Landscape, the wool was felted onto a silk chiffon print. A portion can be seen in the folded natural edge of the pockets and cuffs. Second Time Around was created using the leftover scraps from Piroska Toth, a student in one of my jacket workshops, who had created actual felt yardage and so cut into it to create a jacket. She graciously gave me the leftovers, and I created this pieced vest and a subsequent workshop for felters at a felting conference. Hippocrates was the first person to provide an explanation for hereditary traits. He hypothesized that seeds cause certain traits of the offspring to resemble those of the parents. This idea, known as pangenesis, was the first attempt to explain the transmission of hereditary traits from generation to generation. Brooker, genetics. The exploration of genetics and how we pass on part of ourselves to the next generation has become more important as my children, now grown, developed distinct personalities and skills. We have 44 chromosomes plus the X and Y sex chromosome in 22 homologous pairs. One chromosome of the pair inherited from the mother, and its homologue inherited from the father. My children are part of my DNA and part of their father's. The rigidity of the grid of a hand-woven fabric yields less spontaneity and freedom of expression for the kind of scientific and political themes I found myself wishing to express in the mid-2010s. The disordered attachment of fibers in felting challenged the way I thought about the interlacement of fibers. There was something metaphoric about the chaotic and unpredictable way the scales on a wool fiber attach themselves to one another, much like the chaotic and unpredictable daily onslaught of media and politics and divisiveness that consumes us. Hand felting represents the attempt to control chaos. There were political themes that called for a response from me that neither a woven cloth nor a garment silhouette could voice. That narrative was easier to describe in felt, and pieces like The Wall and Climate Change offered a visual without the distraction of engineering a garment. Oddly enough, almost 10 years later, these pieces still matter, and their voices are stronger than ever, especially eviscerate, verb, deprive of vital or essential content. This piece still resonates, even more than when I first created it. In 2011, I submitted 3 works for an exhibition 9 by 9 by 3 with the Textile Study Group of New York. We were given 3 9 by 9 by 3 boxes and had to create a narrative within those boxes. Although the pieces were not accepted for the original exhibition, 2 of them appeared in the Salon du Refusé, or Exhibition of Rejects, exhibit for many of the works that did not make it into the original exhibition. 13 years later, these 3 works describe even more profoundly the life cycle of growth, destruction, and rebirth found in the ever-changing climate and resulting natural disasters. I still marvel at the macrame vest included here, which I created in 1972. I was all of 17 years old. Macrame was, of course, the textile technique of the times, and along with a copper enamel disc made in art class in high school, I was able to take a bunch of yarn, using half hitches and square knots, and create a shaped dimensional piece which became a vest. Dimensional clothing was a language I spoke and moved into effortlessly. In college, studying fine arts with a crafts concentration, I found the textile studio, and that was a perfect fit for me. I wove my first and only bog jacket in my junior year, proud of myself for creating cloth on the loom that fit the intended shape of the final garment. The garment was not well received as a final project in that it was functional, and that was not the focus of a fine arts degree in academia, at least not in the 1970s. In my senior year of college, I interned as a rug weaver at Einstein Mumji, the carpet department store, at their flagship store in Paramus, New Jersey. I wove a series of 5 rug or wall pieces using pile and tapestry techniques on a large floor loom provided by the college. The first 4 were sold. One of the tapestries sold while the piece was still on the loom. The last one, shown here in the exhibition, hung in the vice president's office. I knew from that experience, among other things, that I would not be pursuing custom rugs or tapestries or two-dimensional works, which in textiles did not appeal to me the way clothing did. Clothing had dimension, front and back, inside and outside. So I purchased back the last tapestry, knowing I wouldn't be making another one. I should mention my beloved mother-in-law here. I spent another internship with a weaver, spinner, bobbin lace maker living in Vermont, where I learned to spin yarn and make bobbin lace. I was already a weaver. This jacket, created in 1979, was entirely hand-spun weft. It was created the year after I married her son. After graduating from college, I struggled to find my niche, and I went back to college just for inspiration. Academia can force you to explore techniques and mediums previously unknown and can give you tight parameters and deadlines to light that fire. I did an independent study on a Theo-Mormon technique of inlay, which was a much faster way of creating imagery on the surface of a textile, but was still largely a two-dimensional technique. The image or content becomes the main focus, and the piece is only as strong as that image. There were a few of the inlaid tapestries from those years, circa 1980-81, still in my archives. They are shown here. I did have success selling some of the pieces, but I wasn't happy creatively. I began to sell my work and created goods, and eventually garments, that could be sold in craft markets throughout the Northeast. I had a lot to learn about running a business, but there were opportunities out there to earn a living, and I just had to weave fast enough to be able to develop a line of goods that satisfied my creative self and that the public would want. Garments made the most sense. Over the next 10 years, I wove 30 yards of fabric at a time, usually 2 to 3 times a week, and cut many, many garments from that yardage. Each new year brought new color palettes and new updated silhouettes. Shown here in the exhibit are 2 complete ensembles, one from 1983 and one from 1985, given back to me some 30 to 40 years later when the client no longer fit into the garment. I used to have a saying taped to my studio door: say yes, then worry. In the early years, it was important, as I struggled to find my creative voice, to try everything, to say yes to every opportunity, because I had no idea what path I would find myself traveling. Saying yes to a request for an article for HANDWOVEN magazine back in 2000 was the beginning of a long career in writing. More than 100 articles later, and looking back over this long and colorful career, I can honestly say I have not a single regret.